For years, millions of people believed they knew exactly who Drew Scott was. He was the polished one, the calm one, the real estate mind behind the dream, the man who could walk into a stressful home buying situation and somehow make everything feel possible. Alongside his twin brother Jonathan, Drew became one half of one of television's most recognizable renovation duos. To viewers, he was not just a TV host. He was the reassuring voice in the middle of chaos. The person who helped families accept the house they did not want at first, only to discover that it could become the home they had been searching for all along. But the strange thing about fame is that it often freezes a person in the exact moment the public first loved them. And when that person begins to change even quietly, people start asking questions. That is why so many fans have wondered what really happened to Drew Scott from Property Brothers. The answer is not a dramatic disappearance. It is not a confirmed scandal. It is not the kind of tragedy that tabloids like to manufacture. What really happened to Drew Scott is quieter, more personal, and in many ways more revealing. He grew beyond the version of himself that television made famous. In the beginning, Property Brothers felt almost like a perfect formula. A couple wanted their dream home. The market crushed their expectations. And then Drew and Jonathan appeared with a promise. Maybe the perfect house did not need to be found. Maybe it could be created. Drew handled the real estate side with confidence and charm, while Jonathan took on the renovation challenge. Together, they made buying and rebuilding a home feel emotional, practical, and exciting all at once. Viewers trusted them because they seemed genuine. Drew did not come across as cold or aggressive. He knew how to negotiate, but he also knew how to comfort people who were scared of making the biggest financial decision of their lives. That balance became his signature. He was the expert, but also the friend. The businessman, but also the brother. The guide, but never the villain. And that kind of public image can become incredibly powerful. It can also become a cage. Because when audiences decide that you are the steady one, they do not always allow you to be uncertain. When they decide that you are the smiling one, they do not always notice the pressure behind the smile. And when your entire career is built around helping other people find home, few people stop to ask what home begins to mean for you. Behind the success of Property Brothers was a level of pressure most viewers never saw. A show like that does not survive only because the houses look beautiful at the end. It survives because the people at the center of it keep delivering trust, episode after episode, year after year. Drew had to remain likable, sharp, funny, professional, and emotionally present at the same time. He had to make nervous buyers feel safe. He had to make impossible budgets sound manageable. He had to make compromise feel like opportunity. And he had to do all of that while carrying a brand that was expanding far beyond one television series. Over time, the Property Brothers name became more than a show. It became a business, a media identity, a lifestyle brand, and a promise to viewers that chaos could be turned into comfort. That kind of success is rare, but it also comes with a hidden cost. The bigger the brand became, the harder it became for Drew Scott to simply be Drew Scott. Then his personal life began to move closer to the center of his public story. His relationship with Linda Phan showed viewers another side of him, one that was softer and more grounded. For a man who had spent years helping other families imagine their future homes, marriage forced the public to see him building a future of his own. And when he became a father, that shift became even deeper. Fatherhood changes the meaning of time. It changes the meaning of ambition. It changes the way a person measures success. The old version of Drew Scott seemed endlessly available to the world of television, travel, filming schedules, business meetings, and public appearances. But the newer version of Drew had something more important waiting at home. That does not mean he abandoned his career. It means his life became more layered than the simple character audiences first met. And that is where the misunderstanding began. Some fans noticed that Drew seemed different. Some wondered whether he had stepped back. Others looked at the changing landscape of HGTV and asked whether the golden age of Property Brothers was quietly fading. But the truth is not that Drew disappeared. The truth is that he matured in public, And that kind of change can be hard for audiences to accept. People do not always miss a person. Sometimes they miss a version of that person that no longer exists. Drew Scott's story is not about a man who lost everything. It is about a man who had to carry everything. The show, the brand, the expectations, the family name, the public image, and now the private responsibility of being a husband and father. What really happened to him was not a sudden fall. It was a slow transformation. He moved from being just the face of a renovation show to becoming a man trying to protect a life that cannot be edited into a perfect reveal scene. And perhaps that is why the question still follows him. Because viewers are not only asking where Drew Scott went, they are asking why the man they remember feels different now. The answer begins with a simple truth. Success can build a beautiful house around you, but sometimes, to keep growing, you have to step outside the walls that made people comfortable. And to understand Drew Scott's story, you have to understand the pressure of being part of a television brand that never really stops moving. Property Brothers was never just a show about buying houses. It became a machine built on trust, repetition, emotion, and reinvention. Viewers did not tune in only to see walls come down or kitchens transform. They tuned in because Drew and Jonathan made the process feel safe. They turned one of the most stressful decisions in a person's life into something hopeful. But when a show becomes that successful, the people at the center of it begin to carry a strange responsibility. They are expected to remain familiar but never boring. They are expected to evolve, but not too much. They are expected to be real, but still polished enough for television. And for Drew Scott, that meant living inside a public identity that looked effortless from the outside, while requiring constant discipline behind the scenes. The smile, the timing, the confidence, the calm voice in the middle of someone else's panic, none of that was accidental. It was part of what made him valuable to the audience. But it also meant that Drew's personal growth had to happen under the weight of a character viewers thought they already understood. The difficult part is that fame does not always punish people through scandal. Sometimes it traps them through consistency. Drew was not known for chaos. He was not the unpredictable celebrity whose headlines changed every week. His public image was stable, family-friendly, professional, and controlled. That gave him longevity, but it also created a very narrow space for change. If he seemed more serious, fans noticed. If he spent more time talking about family, fans noticed. If the focus shifted from the original Property Brothers format to new projects, fans noticed. And in the age of online speculation, noticing often becomes questioning. People began to ask whether something had happened to him. Not because there was one dramatic event, but because the Drew they remembered from the early years no longer felt exactly the same. But that is what time does. It changes the person even when the brand tries to stay recognizable. By 2026, Drew and Jonathan were still active on HGTV, including with Property Brothers. Under Pressure, a newer series built around anxious buyers facing difficult real estate decisions. HGTV described the show as a return of the brothers in a high-pressure home buying format, which makes clear that Drew did not simply disappear from television. But the existence of new shows also reveals something important. The old formula had to adapt. The world that made Property Brothers a phenomenon was changing. Housing became more expensive. Buyers became more cautious. Renovation costs rose. Audiences became more skeptical of perfectly edited transformations. What once felt like a fantasy now had to confront a harsher reality. Drew's role, therefore, could not remain exactly what it was in 2011. He could no longer simply be the cheerful real estate expert, guiding people toward a dream. He had to represent confidence in a market where confidence itself was harder to find. That shift matters because Drew's career has always depended on emotional credibility. He was never just selling property. He was selling the idea that uncertainty could be managed. But when the real estate world feels unstable, that promise becomes more complicated. A nervous buyer watching from home may no longer see a renovation show as pure escape. They may see it as a reminder of everything they cannot afford, everything that feels out of reach, everything that has changed since the earlier days of HGTV. In that environment, Drew's calm presence takes on a different meaning. It is no longer just charming. It has to work harder. It has to convince people that hope is still realistic. And that is a heavier kind of performance than most viewers realize. At the same time, Drew's private life was becoming more important than ever. He and Linda Phan welcomed their son Parker in 2022 and their daughter Piper in 2024, making Drew a father of two. For a man whose career had been built around the concept of home, fatherhood changed the meaning of that word. A home was no longer just a finished space, a smart purchase, or a beautiful reveal at the end of an episode. It became the place where his children would grow, where time would disappear quickly, where every professional choice would carry a personal cost. That kind of change does not always create headlines, but it changes a person deeply. Before fatherhood, a busy schedule may look like ambition. After fatherhood, the same schedule can feel like absence. Before children, success may be measured by how many projects you can carry. After children, success may be measured by how much of yourself you still have left when you come home. And that is the quiet tension at the center of Drew Scott's life now. He is still part of the Property Brothers universe, still connected to the brand that made him famous, still working with Jonathan, still recognized by fans who associate him with dream homes and emotional transformations. But he is also living in a different chapter. He is no longer only the man who helps other families make decisions. He is a father making decisions for his own family. He is no longer only one half of a television duo. He is a husband and parent trying to protect private meaning inside a public career. He is no longer only the polished host who walks through staged homes and explains what could be possible. He is a man facing the same basic question that confronts everyone eventually. After you build the life people admire, how do you make sure it is still the life you actually want? That may be why Drew's story feels more emotional than people expect. It is not because he fell apart. It is because he kept going while everything around him became more complicated. He carried the weight of fame without the obvious drama that usually makes people pay attention. He changed slowly, responsibly, almost too quietly for the public to understand. But sometimes the hardest transformations are the ones that do not look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes the real story is not a collapse. Sometimes the real story is a man realizing that the house he helped build for the world is not the same as the home he must protect for himself. The hardest thing for many fans to understand is that Drew Scott's life did not become smaller after Property Brothers became famous. It became bigger, and that is exactly why he may feel less visible in the simple way people remember him. In the early years, Drew's identity on television was easy to explain. He was the real estate expert. He was the brother who showed the houses, explained the numbers, negotiated the possibilities, and helped nervous families see beyond ugly carpets and outdated kitchens. But after more than a decade in the public eye, that role could no longer contain the full reality of his life. Drew was no longer just in front of homes. He was standing in front of an empire. The Property Brothers name had expanded into multiple shows, production work, brand partnerships, books, design ventures, and a larger media identity that depended on both brothers remaining recognizable while constantly adapting. That kind of success looks glamorous from the outside, but inside it creates a very specific kind of pressure. The pressure to never let the audience feel the machine slowing down. And that is where Drew's story becomes more complicated than a simple "where is he now?" question. He did not disappear from HGTV. In fact, Drew and Jonathan continued appearing in newer formats, including Property Brothers. Under Pressure, a series focused on helping buyers deal with difficult real estate decisions in a strained market. But the fact that the brothers had to move into a show about pressure says something about the world around them. The housing dream that once powered so many renovation shows had changed. Buyers were facing higher costs, tighter budgets, limited inventory, and more anxiety about whether homeownership was even realistic. The old television fantasy was simple: buy the overlooked house, renovate it, and reveal a dream home. But the newer reality is more tense. People are not just wondering what color the cabinets should be. They are wondering whether they can afford the mortgage. whether a renovation will destroy their savings, whether compromise means settling, and whether the dream of owning a home has become a luxury. Drew's job, therefore, changed too. He was no longer only helping people imagine beauty. He was helping them survive uncertainty. That shift is important because Drew's public strength has always been reassurance. He built his career on making stressful decisions feel manageable. But reassurance is harder to deliver when the stress is not just emotional but structural. A bad layout can be fixed. A dated kitchen can be redesigned. But a housing market shaped by affordability problems, financial pressure, and changing expectations cannot be solved with one reveal scene. So Drew had to adjust his role. He had to speak not only as a television personality, but as someone who understood that the dream had become more fragile. That is a heavier responsibility than most viewers realize. When a host on television says, "This can work," the audience wants to believe him. But in the modern housing market, those words carry more weight. They are no longer just part of entertainment. They touch people's real fears. At the same time, Drew's family life was becoming a central part of who he was. He and Linda Phan became parents to their son Parker James in 2022, and their daughter Piper Ray in 2024. A major personal shift for a man whose public career had always revolved around the meaning of home. That detail matters because fatherhood changes the emotional center of a person's life. Before children, a home can be a project, an investment, a design challenge, or a dream. After children, home becomes memory in real time. It becomes the room where your child takes a first step, the quiet hour you miss if work keeps you away, the place where success stops being measured by applause and starts being measured by presence. Drew had spent years helping other families create that feeling. Now he had to protect it for his own. This is the part of his transformation that does not always fit into a headline. A scandal would be easier to explain. A dramatic exit would be easier to market. A feud, a collapse, a public breakdown, those are the stories the internet knows how to consume quickly. But Drew's real story is not built like that. It is built around maturity. It is built around the difficult process of becoming more private while remaining public, becoming more responsible while remaining entertaining, and becoming more grounded while still carrying a brand that depends on movement. That may not sound explosive, but it is deeply human. Because sometimes the most difficult thing a person can do is keep living well after the world has decided what version of them it prefers. For Drew, the challenge is also tied to being a twin in the public eye. His career has always been connected to Jonathan's. Their chemistry is part of the product. Their brotherhood is part of the trust. Their similarity is part of the appeal. But even twins do not live the same life forever. Each brother has his own relationships, priorities, emotional changes, and private battles. The public may love them as a pair, but adulthood keeps pushing them into individual identities. Drew cannot only be Jonathan's twin forever. He cannot only be the real estate brother forever. He cannot only be the man from the early Property Brothers episodes forever. Life demands expansion, even when fame rewards repetition. So what really happened to Drew Scott? He entered the chapter that many public figures fear most. The chapter where he had to remain familiar enough for fans to recognize him, but honest enough to keep growing. He did not vanish, he evolved. He did not lose his place. He outgrew the narrow frame that first made him famous. And perhaps the reason people keep asking about him is not because something terrible happened, but because something ordinary and powerful happened instead. Drew Scott became older, busier, more private, more responsible, and more aware that the life he shows on television is only one part of the life he has to live when the cameras are gone. But there is another part of Drew Scott's story that people often overlook, and it may be the most important one. The emotional cost of being trusted by millions of strangers. Trust sounds like a beautiful thing, and in many ways it is. It is the reason viewers welcomed Drew and Jonathan into their homes for years. It is the reason families believed them when they said a neglected property could become something extraordinary. It is the reason their brand survived far longer than many television personalities ever manage. But trust can also become a burden. Because once people trust you, They expect you to keep being the same source of comfort, no matter what is happening in your own life. Drew was not just expected to host a show, he was expected to remain calm in a culture that was becoming more anxious. He was expected to make homeownership feel possible, in a market that often made people feel defeated. He was expected to carry warmth, humor, confidence, and emotional intelligence at the same time. And he had to do it without letting viewers see the exhaustion that naturally comes with that kind of responsibility. That is why his transformation feels so quiet but so significant. Drew Scott became famous during a television era when renovation shows offered viewers a kind of emotional escape. People watched them to believe that broken things could be fixed, that bad decisions could be corrected, that ugly rooms could become beautiful, and that a family could walk into a house with fear and walk out with hope. Property Brothers worked because it was not only about construction, it was about emotional repair. Drew's role was essential in that process. He was often the one who translated anxiety into possibility. He could look at a couple worried about money, location, or compromise, and make the next step feel reasonable. That ability made him beloved, but it also tied him to a kind of emotional labor that is easy to underestimate. He had to absorb other people's stress and return it as optimism. He had to turn disappointment into strategy. He had to make compromise feel like empowerment. Over time, that becomes more than a job. It becomes an identity. And identities like that are difficult to escape. When someone becomes known as the person who always knows what to do, the public rarely imagines that he may also have moments where he does not know. When someone is known for helping families find homes, the public rarely imagines that he may also be asking where he truly belongs in the next stage of his own life. When someone is presented as successful, balanced, and grateful, people may not see the pressure of maintaining that balance year after year. Drew's situation was even more complicated because his success was shared with his brother. The Scott brothers were never marketed as two separate celebrities who happened to work together. They were a unit, a package, a familiar rhythm. Drew and Jonathan's connection became part of the product. The jokes, the contrast, the twin dynamic, the sense of family trust, all of it made the shows feel warmer. But when your personal relationship becomes part of a professional empire, the line between family and business becomes incredibly delicate. That does not mean there was some hidden collapse between the brothers. It means the opposite. The longer a partnership lasts, the more discipline it requires. Viewers may see chemistry, but they do not always see coordination. They may see brotherhood, but they do not always see the meetings, decisions, schedules, negotiations, creative differences, and brand responsibilities behind it. Drew and Jonathan had to remain connected not only as siblings, but as business partners whose names were tied to a massive audience expectation. That kind of partnership can be rewarding, but it also leaves very little room for personal reinvention. If one brother changes, the brand changes. If one brother slows down, the rhythm changes. If one brother wants more privacy, the audience feels it even before they understand it. Drew's evolution, therefore, was never just about him. It affected the way people perceived the entire Property Brothers world. Then came the deeper question of legacy. For a long time, Drew's legacy seemed obvious. He was part of a television franchise that helped redefine home renovation entertainment. He and Jonathan made real estate and design feel accessible to everyday viewers. They turned practical decisions into emotional journeys. But as the years passed, legacy became more complicated. A person cannot live forever inside the applause of what already worked. At some point, Drew had to ask what came next. Was his future simply more shows, more homes, more reveals, more brand extensions? Or was there a different kind of meaning waiting beyond the format that made him famous? That is a difficult question for anyone, but it is especially difficult for someone whose success depends on being recognizable. Audiences love growth in theory, but they often resist it when it changes the thing they are attached to. This is why Drew's current chapter can feel almost invisible if you only look for drama. He is not the kind of figure whose life is defined by one shocking headline. His story is not built around a single moment when everything fell apart. Instead, It is built around the slower and more universal experience of becoming a different person while the world keeps calling you by an older name. The Drew Scott people first met was energetic, ambitious, charming, and deeply connected to the dream of transforming houses. The Drew Scott of today still carries those qualities, but he also carries more. Marriage, fatherhood, business responsibility, creative pressure, aging, changing audience expectations, and the need to protect parts of his life that do not belong to television. That is not a fall from grace. It is a passage into adulthood under public observation. And maybe that is what makes the question, what really happened to Drew Scott, more revealing than it first appears. It says as much about the audience as it does about him. Viewers are not always asking because they believe something terrible happened. Sometimes they ask because they feel the passage of time through the people they used to watch. A familiar face changes, and suddenly the viewer realizes that their own life has changed too. The old episodes become memories of a different era. The houses, the jokes, the reveals, the optimism, all of it belongs to a time that felt simpler, even if it was never truly simple. Drew Scott becomes a symbol of that shift. He reminds people that even the most comforting television personalities cannot remain untouched by time. So if Drew seems different now, perhaps that is not something to mourn. Perhaps it is the proof that he is still living beyond the frame. The version of him that fans remember was real, but it was never complete. The man behind that version had to keep growing, even if growth made him less easy to categorize. And in the end, that may be the most honest answer to what really happened to Drew Scott. He became more than the role that made him famous, and the world is still learning how to see him clearly. The deeper you look at Drew Scott's story, the more it becomes clear that the real change was not just personal, it was cultural. Drew became famous in a television world that believed in transformation. A bad house could become beautiful. A discouraged couple could become hopeful. A risky purchase could become the best decision of someone's life. That was the emotional promise behind Property Brothers, and for years, it worked because audiences wanted to believe in that promise. They wanted to believe that with the right plan, the right experts, and the right vision, almost anything could be repaired. But the world that watched Drew and Jonathan in the early days is not the same world watching them now. People have become more skeptical, more financially cautious, and more aware that not every problem can be solved with optimism and a renovation budget. That change placed Drew in a difficult position. He still represented hope, but the audience's relationship with hope had become more complicated. In the beginning, the fantasy was clean. A family could not afford the perfect home, so Drew showed them a house that looked disappointing at first. Jonathan explained what it could become. The couple hesitated, worried, resisted, and then finally trusted the process. By the end, the reveal made everything feel worth it. That structure gave viewers a sense of emotional closure. It suggested that fear was temporary, that compromise could become beauty, and that the right guidance could turn uncertainty into joy. But over time, the real world began pressing harder against that fantasy. Housing prices rose. Renovations became more expensive. Viewers started questioning whether the numbers they saw on television reflected the reality they were living. The dream home did not disappear, but it became harder to believe in without hesitation. And when the dream becomes harder to believe in, the people who built their careers around selling that dream must evolve. That is part of what happened to Drew Scott. He had to move from the innocence of the original renovation fantasy into a more mature version of the same idea. He could no longer simply be the charming expert saying, "Trust us, this will work." He had to become someone who understood that trust itself was now more fragile. The modern viewer does not only want beauty, they want transparency, they want practicality. They want to know whether the dream being shown to them is achievable, or just another polished television illusion. Drew's challenge was to keep the emotional warmth that made him famous while adapting to an audience that had become harder to persuade. That is not an easy thing to do. If he becomes too realistic, the magic fades. If he stays too optimistic, the audience may doubt him. So he has had to walk a narrow line between inspiration and credibility. And that narrow line may explain why his public presence feels different now. He is not just performing the same role in a different year. He is carrying a role that has changed meaning. The old Drew could stand in front of a house and represent possibility. The newer Drew has to stand in front of the same dream and acknowledge that possibility comes with pressure, sacrifice, and limits. That kind of maturity may not always feel as exciting as the early seasons, but it is more honest. It reflects a man who has seen enough life to know that transformation is never as simple as it looks on television. Houses can be renovated on a schedule. Human lives cannot. This is especially true when you consider Drew's own life as a husband and father. For years, his public image was connected to helping other people build their futures. But once he had a family of his own, the emotional weight of that work changed. Every house was no longer just a project. Every discussion about home, security, comfort, and family carried a deeper personal meaning. He was not speaking about abstract dreams anymore. He was living inside one. And the more valuable his private life became, the more careful he had to be about how much of himself he gave to the public. That is one of the quietest conflicts in celebrity life. The same audience that supports you can also consume you. Fans want closeness. They want updates, photos, interviews, behind-the-scenes details, and signs that the person they admire is still accessible. But a family requires boundaries. Children require protection. Marriage requires space that does not belong to cameras or comment sections. Drew had to learn how to remain open enough to stay connected with fans, while private enough to protect what mattered most. That balance is not dramatic in the way tabloids prefer, but it is difficult. It means saying yes to some opportunities and no to others. It means accepting that some fans may interpret privacy as distance. It means allowing the public to misunderstand certain changes, because explaining everything would cost too much. And perhaps that is why Drew's story carries a subtle sadness. Not because he is broken, but because growing up often requires disappointing the expectations people have placed on you. The audience may want the same Drew forever, energetic, available, smiling, focused entirely on the next home transformation. But life asks something else from him. Life asks him to be present for his children, loyal to his marriage, thoughtful about his business, and honest about his own limits. So what really happened to Drew Scott is not one event. It is a series of quiet transitions that changed the meaning of his success. He became famous by helping people imagine better homes. Then he had to build a better life behind the image. He became trusted because he made uncertainty feel safe. Then he had to face uncertainty in his own evolving career. He became loved as one half of a brotherly duo. Then he had to keep becoming his own man without breaking the bond that made audiences love them in the first place. That is not a tragedy in the traditional sense. It is the more ordinary, more complicated kind of tragedy that comes with time. The realization that every dream, once achieved, becomes a responsibility. Drew Scott got the career, the fame, the family, and the legacy. But now he has to live with the weight of all of it. There is also a reason Drew Scott's story continues to attract curiosity, even without a public scandal. People sense when a familiar figure has entered a different season of life, even if they cannot name exactly what changed. With Drew, the shift is not in one dramatic headline, but in the atmosphere around him. The early Property Brothers years had a certain lightness. The brothers were younger, the format felt fresh, and the dream of renovation television seemed almost innocent. Drew could walk into a house with a couple and make the whole process feel like an adventure. There was tension, of course, but it was the kind of tension television knew how to solve. A budget problem could be reframed. A design problem could be fixed. A disappointing house could become a hidden gem. The emotional rhythm was clear: doubt, trust, transformation, tears, relief. But the Drew Scott people see now belongs to a different world. He is still warm, still professional, still connected to the brand, but there is more weight behind the smile. He is no longer only selling possibility. He is living with the consequences of having sold possibility for so long. That is an important distinction. When someone spends years helping others chase a dream, The public begins to assume that person has mastered the dream for himself. Drew spoke about homes, families, futures, and smart choices so often that viewers naturally connected him with stability. He became a symbol of the life people wanted to build. But being a symbol is not the same as being free. A symbol has to remain legible. A symbol cannot change too quickly without confusing the people who depend on it. And Drew, whether he intended to or not, became a symbol of trust in an industry often filled with stress, risk, and disappointment. That is a difficult thing to carry. It means that even normal human evolution can look suspicious to an audience used to certainty. If he steps back slightly, people ask where he went. If he becomes more private, people wonder what he is hiding. If the shows evolve, people assume something must have happened behind the scenes. In reality, the answer may be far simpler and far more human. Drew Scott is no longer living only for the version of success that first made him famous. Part of that change comes from the fact that he has had to share his life with an audience for a very long time. Television fame is different from movie fame or music fame because it builds intimacy through repetition. Fans do not just see you once or twice a year. They see you in their living rooms, in reruns, in marathons, in clips, in interviews, in social media posts, and in the emotional background of their own lives. For many viewers, Drew and Jonathan were not distant celebrities. They felt familiar, almost like relatives who showed up every week, with advice, humor, and a promise that everything could be improved. That familiarity is powerful, but it can also become invasive. The more people feel they know you, the more entitled they can feel to explanations when you change. Drew's transformation into a more family-centered, more layered, more mature public figure may therefore feel personal to fans who attach their own memories to the early version of him. And then there is the reality of longevity. Staying relevant for more than a decade in television requires constant adjustment, but adjustment rarely receives the same applause as breakthrough success. When Property Brothers first became a phenomenon, the excitement was obvious. The concept was strong, the brothers were charismatic, and the audience was ready for a fresh renovation format. But after years of success, the challenge becomes different. You are not just trying to win attention. You are trying to keep it without becoming stale. You are trying to honor the formula while proving you are not trapped by it. You are trying to satisfy longtime fans while reaching new viewers who may not have the same emotional connection to the original show. Drew's career has had to survive that difficult middle space between nostalgia and reinvention. That space can be unforgiving. Change too little, and people say the magic is gone. Change too much, and people say you abandoned what made you special. That is why Drew's work today carries a quieter kind of pressure. He has to preserve the warmth of Property Brothers while adapting to a world where the home renovation genre itself is more crowded and more scrutinized. Audiences have seen countless reveals, countless open-concept kitchens, countless emotional endings. The surprise is harder to create now. The formula has to work harder to feel alive. And for Drew, that means his presence has to offer more than charm. It has to offer credibility, maturity, and a sense that he understands the world has changed. He can no longer be only the optimistic guide of the early years. He must also be the experienced professional who knows that dreams are not cheap, renovations are not simple, and home is not just a design outcome, but an emotional responsibility. But perhaps the most personal part of this chapter is that Drew now has something more important than maintaining an image. He has a family that gives the word home a meaning no television reveal can fully capture. That changes everything. It changes how a person values time. It changes how he thinks about travel, filming, business opportunities, and public exposure. It changes the emotional cost of being away. It changes the way success feels when the applause is loud, but the moments at home are quiet and irreplaceable. And it forces a question that every successful person eventually has to face. How much of the life you built for the world is worth keeping if it takes you away from the life you built for yourself? That question may be the real heart of what happened to Drew Scott. He reached the point where achievement was no longer the whole answer. Fame, money, recognition, and a beloved television brand can create extraordinary opportunities, but they do not remove the need for balance. They may even make balance harder. Drew's story is not about a man who lost his way. It is about a man who had to redefine what staying on the right path meant. In the beginning, the path was clear: build the show, grow the brand, trust the brotherly chemistry, and help families find homes. Now the path is more complex. Protect the brand without being consumed by it. Honor the audience without living entirely for them. Remain connected to Jonathan while continuing to grow as an individual. And be present for a family that matters more than any reveal scene ever could. So when people ask what really happened to Drew Scott, the answer is not hidden in some shocking secret. It is visible in the slow, ordinary, powerful way life changes a person. He became successful enough to have options, famous enough to have expectations, and mature enough to know that not every expectation deserves to control him. He did not disappear from the story. He simply stopped being only the character the audience first met. And that may be difficult for some fans to accept, because it reminds them that time does not only change celebrities, it changes the people watching them too. And in the end, the story of Drew Scott is not really about disappearance. It is about what happens when a person becomes so strongly associated with one version of himself that the public struggles to recognize his growth. For years, Drew existed in the minds of viewers as the confident real estate expert from Property Brothers, the man who could turn disappointment into possibility and panic into a plan. He stood beside Jonathan with the kind of easy chemistry that made everything feel natural, as if success had simply arrived because two brothers were charming, talented, and lucky enough to find the perfect format. But long careers are never that simple. Behind every familiar television face is a constant negotiation between who the audience wants that person to be and who that person is becoming in real life. Drew's journey has been defined by that negotiation. He did not abandon the audience that made him famous. He did not reject the brand that changed his life. But he also could not remain forever inside the younger, lighter, simpler version of himself that viewers first embraced. That is why the question, what really happened to Drew Scott, has a more emotional answer than many people expect. What happened is that life kept moving. The television industry changed. The housing market changed. The audience changed. Drew's family changed. His responsibilities changed. The meaning of success changed. In the beginning, success may have looked like more episodes, more viewers, more recognition, more opportunities, and a bigger platform. But over time, success becomes harder to define. At a certain point, the question is no longer whether the world knows your name. It is whether the life attached to that name still feels like your own. Drew reached a stage where the work that made him famous had to coexist with the private life that made him whole. That is not a crisis in the dramatic sense, but it is a turning point. It is the kind of turning point that does not explode in public, but quietly changes the way a person moves through the world. For Drew, the word home has always been central to the story. On television, home was the dream at the end of the episode. It was the reveal, the tears, the open door, the family stepping into a space that finally felt like theirs. But in his own life, home became something deeper and less polished. It became marriage. It became fatherhood. It became the ordinary moments that no camera crew can truly capture. It became the reason to protect time, to draw boundaries, and to understand that a beautiful public career is not the same thing as a peaceful private life. That distinction matters. Drew spent years helping other people build homes, but eventually he had to ask what kind of home he was building for himself. And once that question enters a person's life, everything else begins to rearrange around it. This is where Drew's story becomes quietly powerful. Many celebrity stories are told as rises and falls, as if the only interesting thing that can happen to a public figure is either triumph or collapse. But Drew Scott's story sits somewhere more realistic. He rose, yes. He became famous, successful, wealthy, trusted, and admired. But instead of collapsing under that weight, he evolved under it. He learned that being loved by an audience does not mean surrendering every part of yourself to them. He learned that a brand can open doors, but it can also create expectations that follow you everywhere. He learned that working with family can be a blessing, but also a responsibility that requires care, patience, and constant respect. And he learned that the version of success people applaud most loudly may not always be the version that brings the most peace. So if Drew Scott feels different now, that difference should not be treated as evidence of something dark or hidden. It should be understood as the natural result of time, maturity, and responsibility. The young man who helped build Property Brothers into a phenomenon is still there, but he is no longer alone inside the public image. He now carries the experience of years in television, the pressure of a business empire, the tenderness of family life, and the awareness that fame is not a permanent shelter. It gives attention but not necessarily rest. It gives opportunity but not necessarily clarity. It gives applause but not necessarily balance. Drew's challenge has been to take everything fame gave him and still remain grounded enough to know what fame cannot provide. Perhaps that is why his story resonates more than a simple update ever could. Because on some level, many people understand what it feels like to outgrow an old identity. You may not be a television star. You may not have a famous twin brother or a renovation empire. But you may know what it feels like to be remembered for a version of yourself that no longer fits. You may know what it feels like to keep meeting expectations that were created years ago, before your life became more complicated. You may know what it feels like to build something impressive and then wonder whether it is still giving you the life you wanted. In that sense, Drew Scott's story is not only about fame, it is about the human cost of becoming. And that is the truth behind what really happened to Drew Scott from Property Brothers. He did not vanish. He did not become a cautionary tale. He did not lose the heart of what made people trust him. He simply entered a chapter that is harder to package for television. A chapter where the dream home is no longer just something he helps others find, but something he must protect in his own life. A chapter where success is not only measured by ratings, projects, or public recognition, but by presence, peace, and the ability to remain whole when the world keeps asking for the old version of you. Drew Scott's story may not be a tragedy, but it is a reminder. Sometimes the most dramatic thing that can happen to a public figure is not a fall from grace. Sometimes it is the quiet courage to grow beyond the image that made everyone comfortable.